So we are now recording, and I will post this probably tomorrow. It's a long process. I have to upload this. This goes to a cloud. Then I have to download the recording to my hard drive. Then I have to upload the recording to YouTube. And then I have to pull the link from YouTube and put it on our Canvas webpage. Usually takes a couple hours. So that's why I always say the following day that it gets done. So like I said, without further ado, I'm just going to define these words for you. This is basic stuff. The reason my writing is kind of dorky is because I am writing on a glass screen with a plastic pencil. So sometimes, and I'll spell, if you can't read what I'm writing, just unmute your microphone and say, can you say that again or spell that for me? I don't have any problem with that. So anatomy, I always tell students, anatomy is what is it? And physiology is what does it do? Anatomy is the study of structures in the human body. And physiology is the study of, I'm admitting students as I'm trying to write this, is the study of functions of those structures, okay? So that's it. When I give in-person lab exams, which we're not doing, of course, but when I do that, I always label things, specimens, and I say, name the structure, list its function. So I'm always asking anatomy and physiology. So try to get your head into that thinking mode when we study things. What is it? What does it do? What's the structure? What's its function? Oftentimes, these things are so interrelated. The physiology reflects the anatomy. To give you a quick example of that, the joints between the cranial plates and the head are called sutures. They're immovable because the whole point of this skull is to protect the contents underneath. Very different than the joints in our fingers, which are fully movable. And that's due to the differences in function of physiology. So function dictates structure and structure dictates function. It's kind of like the chicken or the egg. Your book goes into different topics of anatomy. I'm not going to write all of this out. I'm just going to say a few things about them. Gross anatomy, G-R-O-S-S, just refers to what we can see with the naked eye. It's also called macro anatomy. So often when you hear, for example, medical students take a gross anatomy class, that's just human gross anatomy, things that we can see without the aid of a microscope or something like that. Conversely, microanatomy is you have to have the use of a microscope in order to see the things that are being studied. Still admitting students. Systemic anatomy just refers to the study of anatomical structures. Let me just mute people. The study of anatomical structures within organ systems. So in this A&P course, and if you take A&P2, you'll study largely systemic anatomy. You just go, after you do the introduction couple of weeks, you just study the human body, organ system by organ system. In A&P1, we basically just do the first half of that book. In A&P2, you do the second half of that book. So all the materials that you bought for this course are going to be good for both A&P1 and A&P2. Cytology, that means the study of, this is within microanatomy. Cytology, that word just means the study of cells. Cyto means cells. Histology is the study of tissues. We will do some histology in this course. Histo means tissue. Ology just means study of. Developmental anatomy refers to the study of anatomical structures as an organism develops. That can be in utero, before birth, or even after birth as a child develops into an adult. Embryology is technically the specific developmental anatomy study, embryology of prior to birth. There are topics in physiology, I'm not going to list them out, specific topics like neurophysiology, which obviously just refers to the study of the nervous system. By and large, we're going to study systemic A&P. It doesn't mean we're not going to look at the cellular level of things, but mostly we're going to study things system by system. Within those systems, obviously, there are specific organs that we're going to take a look at as well. So the second, I'm just going to add on to this, layer over this. The second topic in your book is the body's organization. There's levels of organization to all living organisms. Since we're studying the human body, the levels, by the way, are the same, but I'm going to use humans as examples. They go in order, by the way, and we're just talking about from super microscopic, the smallest particles, up to the final stage is the organism itself. So we call level 1 the chemical level, and that refers to atoms and molecules. Atoms are things like, in living systems, are things like carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, phosphorus. Those are individual atoms. Molecules are a slight conglomeration of those atoms, but they're still extremely small. Molecule examples would be things like nucleotides that make up DNA, ATP molecules, those are energy molecules that are constructed in cells in the human body. This is level 1, the smallest level. Level 2 is the cellular level. I'm going to put a star next to this one. The only reason I'm starring that is this molecules make up cells. And the cellular level, these are the basic building blocks of all living things, basic units of all living things. So we're all of us are made up of a conglomerate of cells. Why is it such a special deal? Well, it's because they are self-contained entities. Molecules and atoms are not really like that. They kind of just swim around and float around aimlessly. Cellular cells themselves have what's called a cell plasma membrane that delineates, isolates what the inside contents from the outside contents. And the cells also have their own metabolism, their own chemical functions as well. The next level of organization is tissues. A textbook definition of tissues is something like this: a group of cells lumped together or grouped together to perform a specific function. So tissues are masses of cells that have a physiology goal in mind of conducting a specific function or functions. Cells make up tissues. So this level makes up the next one. After tissues, we have organs. Organs are 2 or more tissues, different types of tissues, that are grouped together to perform a function or functions. So tissues make up organs. Example, let's just say the heart, for example. The human heart is made up of many different types of tissues: cardiac muscle, nervous tissue, connective tissue. Blood is actually a connective tissue that runs through the arteries and veins. So organs are 2 or more tissues that perform, in the heart's case, a specific function, which is just to pump blood. That's its sole function. Number 5 is organ system. That is 2 or more organs that are typically physically connected, not always. They don't have to be. For example, the endocrine system is made up of varying endocrine organs all over the body. They don't really have a physical connection like the cardiovascular system. Cardiovascular system, the heart, the arteries, and the veins, they make a loop and they're all physically connected. And finally, number 6, I'm just going to get rid of, I have a screen at the bottom, so I need a little more space. We write organism. That's the entire being or entity, the organism. That would be the human being in this case. So organs make up organ systems finally make up the entire organism. These are the 6 main levels of organization of all living things. So I'm just flipping through. I want you to I want this to be as comprehensive as possible in the time that we have. So next time we're going to layer over this board. Your book labels this requirements of life. Different textbooks, this list is slightly different in different textbooks, and they often title it slightly differently as well. I'll stick to requirements of life. These are necessary functions that all living things exhibit. Think of it like that. First one is maintaining boundaries. So all living things have some sort of boundaries. That means there's an internal environment and an external environment. For us, what creates most of our physical boundary is our integumentary system, or our skin, that separates our internal world from our external environment. All living things have some sort of boundary to isolate them from the environment in which they exist. Movement. This is fairly easy. The human example would be skeletal muscles allow us to move our limbs, and allow us to, for example, I'm moving my mouth as I speak right now. But just make sure that you think of movement both internal and external. So movement is not always external. We have movement going on inside of us all the time. Blood is pumping, food is being digested. Third on the list, responsiveness. This just refers to that all living things respond to their environment somehow, some way. That's also internal and external as well. I'll give you a quick example. We respond to loud noises in our environment. If something crashes right next to you, you flinch or you turn your head toward that noise. That's responding to stimulus in the external environment. We also respond, our bodies respond to internal changes as well. For example, you might have a meal that contains bacteria-rid food in it, and you start to get stomach cramps. Then your internal environment is responding to something as well. Third on the list, digestion. Not all books can include this one, but I think it's a good idea that this one does. This just means to break well, let's start at the beginning. It refers to the ingestion, the breakdown, and the absorption of food. So I'm going to write those words. All living things take in some sort of food source. The breakdown part is technically digestion. Absorption is getting those nutrients that were broken down actually into our bloodstream. Metabolism. All living things exhibit some sort of metabolism. When you see that, everybody's heard the word metabolism. Whenever you see this word, just think chemical reactions. That's what it means. So our body has an overall metabolism. There's millions of chemical reactions going on inside of us all the time. And our cells, our individual cells, also contain some sort of cellular metabolism within that entity. Next on the list is excretion. After we digest things, typically living things excrete waste products in the form of feces in the digestive system or urine in the urinary system. So we need to get rid of things that our body either can't use or that might be toxic to our bodies as well. Certain things in our body we have to get rid of through excretion. Almost done. Reproduction. That occurs on both the organism level, like we reproduce to produce offspring. That's to perpetuate the species. We all know that. If we didn't reproduce, or if any animal didn't reproduce, they would become extinct. So we reproduce at the organism level as well as our cells reproduce at the cellular level. So mitosis, that word mitosis, is just a form of cellular replication or reproduction. And finally, last one on your list is growth. All living things, including human beings, exhibit some sort of growth. That just means physical and physiologic changing throughout that organism's lifespan. I have an old version of your book, so I'm not even going to say what page I'm looking at, but the next topic are the 11 organ systems in the human body. I do want you to review this. It takes me a minute to erase my mistakes. I do want you to become familiar with the 11 organ systems. And usually when I teach this in person, I ask every student to close their books, close their laptops, and we try to name all 11 systems off the top of our heads as a group. I get it, it doesn't make much sense to do that in this setting. So I'm just gonna list them in the order, and then I'm gonna say a few words about each one. The integumentary system, everybody just thinks of the skin, which is the major part of it, but it includes the skin, the hair, our nails, and glands within the integumentary system. The main function of this system is protection, but there are a lot of other functions that when we study that system in detail, you'll learn all of them. I'm going to go in order of your book. Skeletal system, that includes bones, obviously, cartilage, and joints. And its main function is structure and protection, but there's lots of other functions that are provided to our bodies through the skeletal system. It's the site of blood cell synthesis, for example. All of our red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets are actually created in the bone marrow. Next system, muscular. This refers to skeletal muscles. There's 3 types of muscles in the human body. The muscular system that includes all the skeletal muscles which are attached to our bones, provides first and foremost movement, body movement, but also it produces heat, so it helps regulate body temperature. This is the order in which we will study these systems, by the way. The nervous system. Its major players or constituents, the brain, the spinal cord, and peripheral nerves. Its major function is short-term regulation, body regulation, and transmission of electrical impulses. The nervous system regulates things in the body, changes and processing of things in the body in a very fast, short-term manner. The endocrine system is more long-term, which happens to be next. The endocrine system. The major endocrine glands in the human body are up in the brain, hypothalamus, the pituitary, the pineal gland, and then going in an inferior direction down from the head, the thyroid gland in the neck, the thymus gland in the chest, the pancreas is an endocrine gland as well as a digestive gland. Adrenal glands with an A, those sit on top of each kidney, hence the name adrenal. And the ovaries and the testes in the males and the female. Those are the major endocrine glands in the human body. Those are the major players anyway. The function is regulation over a long-term, physiologic regulation long-term, and rather than transmitting electrical impulses like the nervous system, the endocrine system secretes hormones. That's how it signals things. Cardiovascular system. We all know this one pretty well. The major players are the heart, arteries, capillaries, veins, and blood inside of those vessels. The cardiovascular system, its major function is transportation. It transports oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients, waste, hormones, enzymes. All sorts of things are either attached to cells in the bloodstream or dissolved in the plasma, which is the fluid of blood. The lymphatic, I'm going to write lymphatic / immune system. The major players of this system are lymph nodes, lymph vessels, the spleen, the thymus gland in the chest. Those are the major organs. Its major function is to empty reclaimed fluid back into the cardiovascular system. You'll learn that in A&P2, and also to fight infection. Respiratory. Major players of the respiratory system. The larynx, which is what you and I call the Adam's apple in our neck. That's the voice box. It's a group of cartilage plates. But the larynx, the trachea, the bronchi, and the lungs are the major organs. The respiratory system functions in exchange of gas from the environment with the internal world, with our bloodstream. Getting close to finished here. Digestive system. This one has a lot of organs involved with it. I'll give you the major players downstream. Technically, the mouth is considered a digestive organ, believe it or not, but the esophagus, which is the tube that runs from the mouth to the stomach, all three small intestine sections, the large intestine, the rectum, the anus. Some accessory organs of the digestive system would be the liver, the gallbladder, the pancreas. So as you can see, there's tons of organs involved with that. Its main function is to break down ingested food and the absorption of those broken down nutrients into the bloodstream. It also eliminates waste from the body. The urinary system, the major players are the kidneys, the ureters, the urinary bladder, and the urethra. This is a very complicated system that you'll learn about toward the end of A&P2, because the kidneys are the major homeostatic organs in the human body. So I could talk about this for months. Obviously, I'm not going to today. Those are the major organs. Its main function, and there's a million functions, is to rid, I'm writing this out because most people don't know this, rid the body of nitrogenous waste. That's one of its functions that's unique to the urinary system. Nitrogenous wastes are produced when our cells, our bodies break certain nitrogen-based products down in a catabolic reaction, and those waste products have to be gotten rid of out of the body. So rids the body of nitrogenous waste in the urine that is produced. It also helps regulate fluid levels in the body, helps regulate pH levels in the body, helps regulate blood pressure. Almost finished here. I'm just going to write reproductive systems. Your book splits them apart. That's okay. When you study the reproductive systems in A&P2, you will split them apart. The major players in the male system are the testes. Those are the male gonads. And then the male system after downstream or of the testes is just a duct system with certain accessory organs. So there's like the ductus deferens or vas deferens is just a long tube. The prostate gland, the seminal vesicles, those are just glands that secrete fluid into that system. The urethra, because it's shared with the male reproductive system and the urinary system. In the male system, the female does not. And the penis, the male copulatory organ, is part of that system as well. The female system, it would be the ovaries, the oviducts, the uterus, the vagina, and the urinary system and reproductive systems in the female are completely separate. All right, so that takes care of the 11 systems. Your book does list necessary requirements of life, and meaning what nutrients or how can an organism survive. I'm just going to write survival An organism must have some sort of nutrition. We as humans get that by ingesting foods. We also need oxygen. Water is a big one. We don't live very long at all without any ingestion of water. Regulation of body temperature, which we'll get into our next topic of homeostasis. And atmospheric pressure, which we have little to no control over whatsoever, unless we just climb a mountain. That atmospheric pressure changes a little bit, but on Earth in general, that doesn't change much. So those are just some survival needs that humans and most living things need to survive on this planet. I do want to talk about this before we stop in fairly great detail. Homeostasis. I want you to get to know that word, what it means and how it works very well, because I'll ask you quite a few quiz questions on the first question about this. This is the underlying theme of A&P, of anatomy and physiology. And the reason is because I'm going to give you my own textbook definition of this. Our body, it's a process, really, it's an ongoing process in which the body maintains a stable internal environment within limits. Let me just write that out. Maintaining stable internal environment. It's strictly regulated, but there is some fluctuation, so it's not a hard liner. So I'm going to put within limits. Your book, I think this Marie book uses the term dynamic equilibrium to help describe the process of keeping homeostasis. What that means is our bodies are constantly changing. Our body temperature, our pH, our fluid level, all of these things are constantly fluctuating, but they have to stay within a range, a fairly strict range, in order for us to stay healthy. How the body regulates homeostasis constantly and continuously throughout life is through feedback mechanisms. So I'm going to talk about those briefly. Feedback mechanisms are just a mechanisms by which the body maintains homeostasis. There are three components to a feedback mechanism. And they typically work in this order. There are receptors. I'll describe each one in detail after I write them out. There is a control center. And finally, effectors. These are the three components of a feedback system or mechanism. Receptors. This is oftentimes the nervous system. Most of this, it can be the endocrine system. Regulation largely takes place on a daily basis via the nervous system. So receptors are anything that senses a change in the environment, either internally or externally. And then these receptors, once they sense a change in the environment, they send a signal to the control center. The control center processes the signals coming in from the receptor. I'll give you real life examples at the end of this. So the control center receives, processes the information from the receptor, and then sends a command of some sort to effectors. These are typically cells, tissues, organs that respond to the command sent by the control center. So these can be cells, tissues, organs. So that's how a feedback mechanism works. It always works this way. A receptor senses a change, sends a signal to the control center, which is interpreted, and then a command is sent to an effector to do something about this initial change that the receptor detected. There are two types of feedback mechanisms. The first one is called negative feedback. This type of feedback mechanism is by far the most common. Most of our body regulatory systems use negative feedback in order to regulate homeostasis. So that's first and foremost very common. Here's sort of a textbooky definition of what negative feedback means. It means the effector acts with a response that opposes, that's the key word, the initial change sensed by the receptor. Okay, so the effector, that cell, tissue, or organ, acts with a response that opposes the original change sensed by the receptor. I'm not gonna erase this. I'm just gonna go back to my previous board. In the event, I'm gonna give you an example of negative feedback. You walk outside, we're all probably dressed right now in short sleeves and shorts, or t-shirt and shorts, whatever, because it's in the 80s, it's gonna be in the high 80s today. If you were to walk outside in February dressed like you are right now, and it was 20 degrees out, you would have receptors mostly located in your skin that sensed the cold air. It sensed a change in your environment, okay? Those receptors, they're just nerve endings, they would send a signal to your brain, the control center. The brain would receive and process those signals and say, make sense of it and say, it's really cold. If we don't do something physiologically, body temperature could drop dangerously. And so the brain sends a command signal to all of the muscles close to the surface of your body. Those are the effectors, and it causes you to start shivering. When we shiver, when we're cold, those are just really small muscular contractions that, guess what, produce heat, produce body heat. And so that body heat that's produced by shivering opposes the original change sensed by the receptor, which was cold. So we have cold causing the body to eventually produce heat. That's why we use the word oppose, and the reason it's called negative feedback is because once, let's use our shivering example, once the body temperature heats up enough, it shuts off itself. It sends a negative signal back to shut off the shivering once we warm up enough. The second type of feedback system in the human body is positive feedback. This is very rare. I can only think of two classic examples in the human body to describe this. But the definition of this is the effector, in this case, number 3 effector, acts with a response that enhances the change sensed by the receptor. So you can see it's the opposite. And I'm going to underline the word enhance. I'll circle it. this is super rare in the human body. The two classic examples that are typically given are, these are just examples of positive feedback. I'm going to write childbirth, in parentheses, labor. Labor refers to the intense uterine contractions that are exhibited during the birth of a child. So here's how that positive system typically works. When the unborn child late in the third trimester descends in the uterus of the mother, usually head down, that causes a stretch in the wall, muscular wall of the uterus. So the uterus is shaped like this, sort of an upside down pear shape, right? And these are the oviducts. Here are the ovaries. The child that grows in the uterus grows in this space of the uterus. As it gets bigger and bigger and grows developmentally, eventually late in the third trimester, the child ends up descending in the uterus, and the head typically, not always, but typically children come out head first. So the developing child is head pointing downward. That causes this part of the uterus, the cervical part, to start to stretch. There are receptors in the wall of the uterus here. They're nerve endings. They sense that stretching, and they set that would be the receptor, and they send a signal to the brain, which is the control center. The brain says, the uterine wall is being stretched, and it causes a hormone called oxytocin to be released. Oxytocin in turn travels back to the uterine wall, binds to receptors on the uterine wall, and causes the smooth muscle to start contracting. As this uterine wall contracts, these stretch receptors keep feeding to the brain. That causes more oxytocin to be released in greater quantities. That causes the uterus to contract even more. That's why we call it a positive feedback, because the effect or the change that's happening here is enhancing the original change, which was stretching and contracting. The second classic example sounds like homeostasis, but it's a different word. So this would be example 1. Example 2 is called hemostasis. This is blood clotting. When we bleed, there's a positive feedback mechanism that enhances the process of blood clotting to make sure, it's a life-saving mechanism, to make sure that we stop bleeding, if at all possible. I'm not going to go into the details of this. It's wildly complicated. You'll learn it when you study the blood in A&P2, but there's an enzymatic pathway. Damaged tissue, let's just say I have a blood vessel. If it gets damaged or torn and starts to leak blood, the damaged tissue in this area releases chemicals. That tells, the chemicals are released into the bloodstream, and it tells enzymes in the bloodstream to be activated. And the more damaged tissue chemical, it's called tissue factor, that gets released in here, the more our blood clots. It's like a snowball running down a snowy hill. It gets bigger and bigger. And that process doesn't stop. That positive feedback mechanism doesn't end until the bleeding stops. All right, so that gets rid of homeostasis, positive, negative feedback. The last thing I'm going to say about homeostasis, I just want to use this space in my whiteboard before I go on to a new one. Homeostatic imbalance. Usually, when our homeostasis gets out of whack far enough beyond those normal limits, we feel sick. So it's typically caused by disease, as well as aging. So any defined disease causes major homeostatic imbalance, things like cancer, as well as all sorts of other disease. And the process of aging also contributes to homeostatic imbalance because our organ systems just simply wear out. They can't keep up with the demands of maintaining homeostasis. All right, I'm just looking at my clock, see where we are on time. I'm going to try to get us done. I'm going to cruise through chapter 1 quickly and try to get us done in the next 10 or 15 minutes. The next part of your textbook talks about anatomical language, terms, directions, regions, planes. I'm going to clear my drawings. And pull up a new whiteboard and just talk about anatomical language. I don't have time to go through every single body landmark on figure 1.7, which is a male figure standing facing forward and facing, you see the posterior side of that figure. But I do expect you to be familiar with these terms. I can verbally go through them very quickly. Let me do that. Let's see. I'm going to go to share screen here. So really quickly, I'm just going to do this. The word cephalic means head. Frontal is particularly the specific body landmark of the forehead. Orbital means eye. Some of these you know already. Orbital means eye, nasal means nose, oral means mouth area. Mental, right here in the chin. You probably didn't know that one. They don't put, oh, it's on the backside. Otic or otic is the ear region. Cervical means neck region. Thoracic means the whole chest. Sternal, axillary, and mammillary are smaller areas within the thoracic area. So sternal refers to where the sternum is, right in the middle of our rib cage. Axillary is actually the armpit area. Mammary is where the nipple is. That's where the mammary glands are located. And they don't put this anymore on this diagram, but the word pectoral refers to this big sheet of muscle across the chest, the pectoralis major. Abdominal refers to the abdominal region, the abdomen. The pelvic region is the pelvis. The umbilical specific region is where the umbilical cord was. Inguinal just refers to the groin area. Pubic or genital region gets its name because the pubis, or there's a bone right behind the genitals called the pubis. That's where it gets its name. Along the upper limb, what you and I call the shoulder is acromial with an A. It gets its name because there's a process on the scapula, this bony part of our shoulder that we feel that sticks up. Brachial is upper arm. Antecubital is the crux of the elbow. Antebrachial is the forearm, just going down the list in my head. Carpal is the wrist. Manual or manus is the whole hand. Digital or fingers. Palmar is the palm. Moving down into the leg, femoral or femoral is the upper leg because the femur bone is located there. Patellar is the kneecap area because the patella is the name of a bone. The front of the lower leg is crural with a C, C-R-U-R-A-L. The back side, the calf side, the posterior side of the lower leg is called sural. Fibular is the side of the lateral side of the lower leg. Pedal is foot, tarsal is ankle, calcaneal is the heel, plantar is the sole of the foot, digital is toes again on the back side, occipital is the back of the head, scapular is where the scapula bones are located, upper back, vertebral is the middle of the back, lumbar is the lower back, gluteal is the buttocks region, popliteal is the back of the knee. We went through that. I know I went through that pretty quickly, but I want to spend a little bit more time on directional terms. So I'm going to call it another whiteboard. I will ask you a few questions on the first quiz about by the way, here's my disclaimer. Don't think that these mini lectures take the place of reading the book. They do not, because I don't have time to be comprehensive. So you have to be responsible for yourself getting the information. I try to highlight the major points in real language. So directional terms usually refers to when we compare two things on the human body, this to that. So directional terms almost always are in context of two different things or places on the human body. I'm writing the word superior and inferior. Superior just means above, inferior means below. When we talk about most of these terms, we're talking about a figure standing in anatomical position, not lying down, standing straight up, facing forward, feet on the ground, arms dangling down with the palms facing forward. So anything superior just means above, anything inferior means below. Quick example, my eyes are superior to my mouth. They're above. My mouth is inferior to my nose. It's below. So that's pretty simple. Some of these are really simple. Other ones are not quite as obvious. Anterior, posterior means front and back. Once again, we typically use them in context of comparing two things. So I don't know how familiar you are with the organ placement in the human body, but for example, my intestines would be anterior to my kidneys because the kidneys are behind. My intestines are in front of the kidneys. The trachea, the windpipe, is anterior to the esophagus. It lies in front of the esophagus. My vertebral column is posterior to my heart. It lies behind my heart. All right, you got the message. Medial and lateral. These words mean toward the middle or midline of the body or further away from the midline of the body. Quick example. My heart would be medial to my lungs because it's closer to the midline than my lungs are. But my ears are lateral to my eyes. They're further away from the midline. So we use the word lateral. This means toward the midline. This means away from the midline. Intermediate just means between two other things. That's all. I'm not even going to write that one down. So my heart would also be intermediate to my lungs. It lies between them. Proximal and distal. This is the one that gives students the most confusion. We use this typically when we compare two things on a limb, two structures. On an arm or a leg. This one, proximal, means closer to the body, the trunk of the body. This one just means further away from the trunk of the body. And remember, we use these terms when we're talking about, so for example, my elbow is proximal to my wrist in anatomical position. It's closer to my body. My ankle is distal to my knee. It's further away from the body. The reason we don't use, a lot of students want to use superior and inferior when comparing two things on a limb. The reason that becomes confusing, and this helps clarify, is what if I was lying down? Or what if I was, if I had my arms up in the air? So when I'm standing in true anatomical position with my arms down, my elbows are superior to my wrists. But if I raise my hands straight up in the air, now my elbows are inferior to my wrists. So that's why this becomes confusing when we compare two things on the same limb. Finally, superficial and deep. That one's easy. Superficial just means toward the surface. Deep means toward deeper, away from the surface. Usually it refers, we use that language in terms of injury to the body, a superficial burn or a superficial laceration in the skin. I know I'm going fast here, but I want to say something about most of this business. Because if I don't get to it, you'll just be responsible for it on your own, which is okay, and you can email me whenever you'd like. Body planes and sections. A sagittal plane is just one that is vertical in anatomical position, so one that is straight up and down. It separates something into a right and left piece. So a mid-sagittal cut would be in the very middle of the body and separate. If we were to make a mid-sagittal cut down an entire person, it would separate that person into a complete right and left half. Frontal, which is also called coronal, by the way. Picture me standing sideways to you and you slicing me in a vertical cut, and you separate me into an anterior, a front, and a back, an anterior and posterior section. This one would be right and left section. This one's anterior, posterior. A transverse plane or cut separates things into a superior and inferior piece. So if you were to take a samurai sword and cut me straight along my belt line through the middle, that would cut me into a superior and inferior half. And finally, the word oblique refers to a diagonal plane or cut. Anywhere in the body, the word oblique means diagonal. Dorsal body cavities is pretty self-explanatory, and it's that we're almost to the end here. Dorsal body cavities, we call it the dorsal body cavity. That includes the cranial and vertebral cavity. So I think it's figure 1.9 in your book, highlights the dorsal body cavity in yellow. It includes the head, the cranial cavity, and the vertebral cavity where the spinal cord is. And then the ventral body cavity would include the thoracic cavity, the chest separates by the diaphragm to the abdominal cavity, and finally the pelvic cavity. Those are the major cavities that are typically separated by membranes in the body. So briefly touch on this. This just refers to thin, typically connective tissue. So very thin, I'm going to write CT for connective tissue. The major membranes in the human body are oftentimes serous membranes. The word serous means fluid secreting. And they are double layered. There are major membranes that encase organs mostly, but also delineate certain areas of the body. I'm going to give you some examples. Where we find serous membranes, which are double layered and fluid. Why fluid secreting? Because that reduces friction. So we find these membranes wherever there's moving parts in the human body. Examples, classic examples of serous double layered membranes would be the pericardium, which is a double layered fluid secreting membrane around the heart. There are the pleura, which is a double layered serous fluid secreting membrane around the lungs. And something called the peritoneum, which is a double layered fluid secreting membrane around the abdominal organs, mostly the intestines. So the last thing I'm gonna cut this off after this. This double-walled membrane the layer that is closest to the actual organ, that covers the organ itself. So this layer here, let's do different colors. So this red layer here actually sits on organ tissue. If this organ, let's say, is the heart, this double-walled serous membrane that we've described up here, specifically as the pericardium, there are two layers. There's a visceral layer that sits right on the heart muscle. And then the outside layer here is called the parietal layer. And it oftentimes connects to the inside of the cavity itself. The fluid, the serous fluid, is typically secreted mostly between these two layers. That's how these serous fluid secreting membranes encase organs, generally are organs that move and need the reduction of friction because of that movement. All right, guys, I'm going to cut it off there. If I have time, I'll touch on the other body cavities or the quadrants and body regions that are at the very end of the chapter. I want to give you a chance to ask me any questions, but before we do that, let me first cut off my recording